Way to go, Pastor.
Thank you.
Thanks for waking us up.
Oh, no problem. With the text? Yeah. Yeah. I got you. That's why I try, when we have D groups, am I good? I don't take the risk of laying down on D group days because I might not make it back. Oh. Thanks, sir. Was anybody not here last week and needs last week notes? William? Okay. Tim? Were you, how many of the classes did you miss? One or two? Just one? Okay. All right. Last week. Is that what? That's today's. Yeah, today's. Okay. Uh-oh. Why are we doing that? Alan, you in here? No. Uh-oh. Okay. I work so hard on these slides, and every week it seems like these slides never want to work. William? All right, this is the reading from last week, and these are the notes from, let me make sure, nope, that's class 2, never mind. You need class 3. There's class 3. That's class 2. Class 3. Yeah, go ahead and work on it, Kevin. All right, William, here you go. There you go. There we go. We're good.
Good job.
All right. It's right 5 on the dot. So we're going to go ahead and, I don't know what's going on over there. Oh, no. It might come on, it might not. All right, guys. So we're going to go ahead and get going. I've told y'all this every week. Thank you for sticking with it. Every week we get a little less and less. And that's usually what happens, especially when you do history. History is hard to follow. History is hard to learn, study, research. But if you're a history nut like I am, I can do this all day. I love history and love a lot of this. So I told you, I apologize if you watched the review video I did for you this week. I told you we wouldn't have reading, and I lied. So you do have reading this week, and so I forgot to bring it with me, but I could go get it at the end. There's a really good book called A History of Black Baptists. And so it is a really good book that was written. We touched on it very briefly last week about African Americans and churches. And so I've got about 6 pages for you to read. We will not have D groups next week. So we'll have the chili cook-off from 4 to 7. So this is our break in the semester. This is our fall break. So 4 weeks. We're 4 weeks in after today. And I've just noticed that, I don't know about your binder, my binder is getting a little thick. So I don't know if we're going to be able to get any more notes in there or not. But we are going, my goal today is to take us to 1860. That is my goal. We're not going to tackle the Civil War before fall break. We're going to save the Civil War for after. And we're going to take the Civil War all the way. I'm probably going to stop at 2000. I'm not sure if I'm going to do any of that, but we've got a lot to talk about, especially the conservative resurgence of the 1980s we got to get to. We got to get through World War II, which is going to be crazy. So I'm hoping that we can make it. by 8 weeks, or 4 more after this one. So we'll just have to wait and see how that goes. Before we do our review questions, well, let's go ahead and do the review questions, and then I've got something special before we get into our notes. All right, raising of hands. In what year did the Charleston Baptist Association first attempt to incorporate itself? What year was the first time they tried to incorporate? You got an idea? No? 1785. So y'all are 0 for 1. As my preaching professor says, y'all got to get with it. All right. Number 2, what was the model in the 1780s and 90s for training pastors? What was the model? You can raise your hand if you remember. Buddy? Yep, and where would they live? In their house. What was one of the strengths of doing that? The books. Yeah, that's really good. All right, number 3. What group of people did the Charleston Baptist Association raise money for? Oh, which group of people did they raise money for and send missionaries to? In 1802. Kevin?
I may be wrong, but is it the separatists?
Nope.
No.
Nope. So they sent a group of missionaries to a local people group. That's right. Marion got it right. So the Catawba Indians is who they did that to. Good job, Marion. What?
Something changing about brother.
Number 4, who are the 2 international missionaries that South Carolina Baptists get involved with in the teens of the 1800s? One name you gotta know. The other, yep. That's right. That's right. Luther Rice and Judson. I call him Mr. J. Adoniram. Okay. No, Furman. No, was not a missionary. He was just a pastor. The Luther Rice and Adoniram Judson, Mr. J. Number 5. When did? Yeah, this might be the last week we have slides. When did the First Baptist Convention in America begin, and what was it originally called? Don't give me the big name, give me the short name. Give me the year, and then give me the name.
I think the year was 1812.
1814. Close, really close. What was the name of that First Baptist Convention in America? Yep, triennial. Yep, South Carolina would come in 1821, and so we talked about that. How many delegates attended the very first South Carolina Baptist Convention in 1820? Well, I just gave the answer to that. 1821. Yes, buddy. 6. That's right. How many? This is your last review question, and then you're off the hot seat for 2 Sundays. How many Baptist associations in South Carolina were represented through the 6 delegates? 3. That's right. Can anybody rattle them off? Charleston, yeah. Savannah River, and then Edgefield. So good job, guys. Good job. You started out rough, but you came through strong at the end. All right, so before we go into our notes today and we start in the 1820s, I do want to talk to you. I see that photo didn't make it. I want to talk to you about the reading that I've given you for this week with a man named John Jasper. Has anybody heard of John Jasper? All right, so John Jasper was born into slavery, and so that's actually not what your reading's about, excuse me. But I want to tell you about this guy, and he represents, and we're not really going to get into the era that he preached in. He was born in the 1820s, and he died in 1901. But he was the first black preacher, not first, one of the first well-known black preachers of his era. And so he was born into slavery. And so after the Civil War, he's free and he starts preaching. Now, what makes John Jasper, and I encourage you to go home, look him up, read some articles. There's some really good articles out about him. What makes John Jasper so interesting is that, in my opinion, he has one of, and obviously I've never heard a sermon, but reading what people wrote about his delivery, I think he has one of the best sermon deliveries of the modern era. He was an excellent orator. God gave him a great gift. Now, uneducated. And so he, went to seminary, did some things, but as was the era of the day, topical preaching, take a verse and do what you got to do. Here, he needs the notes. Okay. And so, what makes him so famous is he preached a sermon. I'm trying to remember the name of it. I think it is "The Sun Do Move," what he called it. And so he preached a sermon, and believe it or not, he preached a sermon over 200 times, and his delivery was so good that the United States Congress asked an African American preacher to come and preach to the Congress. Now, his theology wasn't great, and what I mean by that is that sermon, "The Sun Do Move," his main text was from Joshua 10:13, and you can look at that later on, but he preached that the earth was flat. Okay? And he preached that there were four corners of the earth and that it was not round and that the sun rotated around the earth, not the earth around the sun, which is why he called it "The Sun Do Move." Now, it is a ridiculous sermon. It is awful. It takes verses out of context. He pulls from Revelation and says the four angels in Revelation 7 are on the four corners of the flat earth. Now, we need to ask the question, why would pulpits all across America, white and black, why would they invite him to come and preach an awful sermon? No, that's a good idea, but no, not exactly. Well, the main reason is because of his delivery. People wanted to hear the man preach. They didn't really care what he was preaching about. They just wanted to be able to say, "I heard John Jasper preach." And so that has a lot to do with, and that's just a little nugget, you get that for free. But that just shows that delivery and preaching is so important. I know this isn't a preaching class, I know, but and especially for this era that we're getting ready to talk about Baptist history, content wasn't always the main thing for them. Now, I think content's really important, but as I've heard guys before, there's a lot of guys got some great content. I wouldn't want to go here and preach again. You know what I mean? Delivery is really, really important. And so he was very gifted with that. His theology was really messed up. I do believe he's a Christian. I believe he'll be in heaven and I'll get to see him there and all that. But his delivery was incredible, and he broke a lot of racial barriers in the pulpit, especially in the North, even though he thought the earth was flat. So anyway, all right, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what we're going to do today. We're done with that. All right, you've got your notes. First question I want to ask you, and like I said, Richard Furman died in 1825, and so what I believe is after he passes, Richard Furman, we walk into a brand new era of history in South Carolina. And so I've coined it, I don't know if anybody else uses it, but I call it the post-Furman era is what we're walking into. So we're leaving 1821-ish today, and we're going to go right up to the Civil War. So first question, did associations continue to play a vital role for SC Baptists even with the start of the South Carolina Baptist Convention? So when I left you last week, we talked about how the convention formed in 1821, the state convention, and I told you how 13 years of the Baptist Convention, only 3 Baptist associations were present. So we need to ask the question, if we've got the convention, do the associations matter anymore? Right? Where do the associations fall in all this? So throughout the rest of the 1820s and into the 1830s and 1840s, state conventions remained big dreams of cooperation. What does that mean? They were dreams. They were not reality. The convention really didn't take off until the Southern Baptists formed in 1845 over slavery. And we'll talk about that today in a few minutes. But associations were the main thing. So eventually the convention is going to become the big body that it's used to today. But at that time, I'll just be real frank with you. I think, this is my theory, I think that most Baptists in South Carolina were like, well, that was Richard Furman's deal and he's dead. So we're going to do the association thing. And that's what most churches in South Carolina did. So the local association, for most, not all, Baptists in South Carolina, the association is still, at this time, the epicenter of cooperation among churches. 1820s, 30s, and 40s, Baptist churches began popping up in the Low Country and in the Midlands. And so here and there you see a few church plants. It says the back country is the Midlands. That's a typo. That's the upstate. Upstate doesn't have a ton of churches at this time, but the Midlands, obviously, this is when our church was formed during this time period, and a lot of others in our area. So as Baptist churches begin to spread across all three major regions, you start to see cooperation increase. And so according to Dr. Finn, who is a history professor at North Greenville, very good historian, his theory is that when 2 to 4 Baptist churches in the same region, mostly rural, were planted, shortly after that, conversations about cooperation would begin. And that's when Baptist associations begin. Don't turn the next page. I'm about to ask you a question, so don't cheat. How many associations are there today in South Carolina? Southern Baptist associations. Up.
42.
You look?
No.
You guessed?
But you said that one time before.
Oh, I did? Okay. Well, you got it, Keith. 42. 42 Baptist associations in South Carolina. All right, now you can turn the page. And so these conversations led to the forming of Baptist associations. So what's very interesting, it's hard for me to explain this. Baptist associations today, in my opinion, are not what they were in the beginning. That doesn't mean that they're not good. I think they're vital. I think they're important. We are blessed with a great association. Not all of the associations in our state are good associations. And most of it today focuses on missions, which is good. But in the beginning, the associations focus more on the churches, keeping the churches healthy and unified. And so I think it's really interesting. Most associations, their vision follows that of whoever their director of missions is. And yes, I believe missions are an important part of the association, but I also think having a hand on the churches is important too. I think both of those can go hand in hand. So question 2, what was the benefit of local Baptist associations in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s? So since associations are popping up very quickly wherever numerous Baptist churches were being planted, it does cause us to ask the question, what were the associations at this time offering that the convention was not and made them so popular? Number 1, opportunity for fellowship among pastors. So for these small associations, this was big. Now, let me go back. So in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, most of these churches are being planted in most of South Carolina at this time is completely rural. Most of it, outside of Columbia and Charleston. And so when these churches popped up, not all of them, but our church is a great example of this. Most of them were all planted by families. Most churches were planted by large families, distant related families, because most of these communities, they were all related. And ours is the same way. And South Carolina is definitely a good example of that. And so this was big that they had fellowship. Most pastors were still homegrown or sent out from other local congregations. And so education still hadn't taken off yet. So the fellowship provided them to share ideas, theological insights, and they would even share books. And so circuit rider preachers and Baptist beginnings hadn't really taken off yet, but some pastors were already pastoring several churches at a time. You really see circuit preachers really take off after the Civil War. They do exist at this time, but most of them at this time in South Carolina are still your homegrown preacher boys. Let's put a Bible in their hand, that kind of thing. And you got to remember, this was a big deal for these pastors to gather together in the association because they did not have, or obviously they were not full-time pastors. They're farming. They're doing whatever job they can, and then preaching on the weekend. And so most of these pastors were uneducated, and so the associations did provide some insight there. So secondly, it provided opportunities for cooperation. So since the beginning, Baptists have been committed to planting churches, missions, and education. That is something we are big on, and we still are today. Associations were a big part of this. So what kind of cooperation were the associations involved in? Number one, church planting, starting new churches. Now, I want you to know too, our association, Lexington, has this big, nice building. Okay, the associations don't have a building at this time. There is no associational office. There is no director of missions. The pastors of the churches serve the association. There was no DOM. That word didn't exist at the time. I think Johnny's new title is, Beverly, is it Executive Associational Mission Strategist? I just call him DOM, but anyway, it's some kind of crazy title. And so that was a big thing. So you start to see the tide shift, because before this, autonomous churches would do the church plants. Now the association comes alongside. The second thing the association did was supply preachers for churches. Now, and I think I've already said this in the class already, but you see when I've written these notes, I have said preachers. I am not saying pastors. These guys were not pastors. These guys are preachers. And what I mean by that is they got in the pulpit on Sunday or whenever the church met and they preached. If somebody died, they would do a funeral. That was regular. Outside of that, if you were in the hospital or you were sick, the church cared for the church. Preacher didn't just come. That wasn't expected and that wasn't normal. And so they wanted somebody to preach. And so pastoralist churches were quite the norm in South Carolina at this time. The early associations, just as some of them do today, would have a list of young and or old retired preachers. I don't even know why I wrote that, because retiring wasn't a thing. Obviously at this time. You worked until you died. So the preachers were no exception to that. So they would have a list of preachers that were ordained and licensed and could supply preach when need be. Now, I do want to give you a little history lesson quickly on the licensing of preachers. So today, licensing a young man or old man or whatever age to preach is really just formality. The church votes on licensing. Back then, it was a big deal. So kind of what would happen then is you had to have a preaching license to be able to show up at a church and preach. And so that license was issued by the church that you came out of, affirming that you can preach. And so you couldn't, the guys would, if a guy was traveling and he came upon a local congregation and they were having church, literally it was not uncommon for him to show them his license and preach. That was very normal. And it's hard for us to even think about that. Also, the associations provided accountability in vetting new ministers. So when a young man would feel the call of God on his life to preach, the association was asked to get involved to see if that individual was ready and or qualified to be licensed by the local church to preach, and then ordination would come later. And so these committees, for lack of a better term, from the association would be made up of local pastors. The Lexington Baptist Association still has an ordaining council today for churches who wish to involve the association in the ordination process. But you do not have to. We are autonomous. When we ordained Pastor Chris, we did not get the association involved. We did that in-house. Myself and Pastor Steve. And so, you don't have to involve them, but at that time, it was the norm. And so one reason in particular the local associations began providing accountability to vet ministers was that many of their rural churches that were away from established towns and communities would have men just randomly show up and say they want to preach if they didn't have a license, right? And so you get into a lot of interesting things. The association would get involved and make sure these, I'm using this phrase, fire in the belly preachers were doctrinally sound. So at this time, you've got a lot of John Jaspers running around. Now, he's a great, orator, great delivery, but you got guys running around that have no biblical literacy or very little. And so that's going around. That's happening a lot. And so pastoring, like I said, I already mentioned this, was not a big part. It was really preachers. The preacher would show up. He would he would preach, and he would be involved in missions and education in local associations. So like today, people have many expectations of pastors. At that time, they wanted their pastors to preach, and they wanted their pastors to be involved in the workings of the association. That was pretty much it. And if somebody died, come deliver a funeral sermon. That's pretty much what was done. And you got to also remember they didn't have phones or anything, so not every funeral had a minister. And so that's important to know too. Lay people would do that as well. My great grandfather George Washington Henderson, not the George Washington, he was named after George Washington, but he was a deacon, and he founded a church in Transylvania County. He was a Civil War veteran. I've told you all this story many times, but he was in a prisoner of war camp in Tennessee, and they allowed his wife to come. She had just given birth to a baby, and they were stopped on the way by Cherokee Indians. The baby died, and they went and stayed for the remainder 2 years of the war in the prisoner of war camp with him, his wife and his 7 kids. So anyway, he came back and was a lifelong deacon at the church that he planted. He died in 1914. His son would end up becoming a great, well-known preacher in the mountains. His name was Isaac Henderson. He was also an orator. I have some of his sermon notes, believe it or not. Not the best sermons in the world. We've come a long way. But man, just to hear things that have been said about him and written about him. He got his feelings hurt as he got older, so he quit preaching. But in his 70s, he quit preaching. But he was known in the hills of North Carolina as one of these fire in the belly preachers, so to speak. And so I say all that to say George Washington Henderson did a lot of funerals, because there were times that they didn't have a pastor. Many times they didn't have a pastor. And so he would do the funeral as a deacon. And so, they just didn't have anybody. So if somebody died, well, let's go ahead and put them in the ground and say a few words, and that was it. So that's kind of the era there. Any questions? I haven't paused for questions or comments. Anybody? Yes.
There wasn't any standardization you could talk of at all back in them days.
No standards.
No, they ain't.
No. The Charleston Association did have some standards for ordaining. They did have some documentation for that, but most associations did not. Yeah. All right. The other thing associations did at the time is doctrinal accountability. So this is something they were big on. The early associations were not just involved in the accountability of new ministers, but the doctrines of the churches. So the local associations would have a committee that was made up of local pastors who would seek to help churches that tried to stray. They would keep them in line with Baptist praxis. I call it praxis, practice, whatever. If there was any indication that a church was saying from their doctrinal beliefs, the committee would be assigned. They would go and speak with the members, not the pastor. The members were in charge, because that pastor might not be there next year. That was very common for them. And so they would go and articulate and discuss the issues. At this time, pastors were not really responsible for the doctrine like we are today, which is not in line with the Bible. They got some things right. They got deacon ministry right pretty well. Biblically, but there's some things they didn't get right. But they were to ensure that they knew the Word. So what's the key takeaway? In the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, we see Baptists are beginning to see that we are better together than we are apart. Now, they're not doing the convention thing like Furman wanted them to do. Isolation is still a really big deal to Baptists at this time. Baptists, like some churches are today, they don't want to be involved with anybody but them. And so every year we go to the convention, and we've got 2,000 churches, and last few years only 300 to 400 churches in our state are represented at the state convention. Pastors don't care about it anymore. Not just pastors, their people don't care about it. This church really, I mean, you guys care a lot about the association, about the convention. You guys are really involved with all that, which is good. That is not the norm, even today. Even today. A lot of Southern Baptist churches in our state are Southern Baptist because that is the predominant thing to do, but not because they want to cooperate for the sake of the gospel. A lot of them are like, well, we just go stay over here and do our thing. Not a great attitude, but it happened here. I mean, it happened historically. So the conventions were not popular at this time, but it would build and it would happen. Any questions? Comments? All right, third question we need to ask. What was the period between 1820 to 1840 known according to South Carolina Baptist historians, and what is the significance of this period? So 2 weeks from today, this will be one of your review questions, so you might want to remember that. Star it. There you go, Marion. Go ahead and star it. There you go. Dr. Nathan Finn is a great South Carolina Baptist historian. He refers to this as the boom time for South Carolina Baptists. And so this is not just in South Carolina, but it's also in neighboring states, Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. And I find this neat. Our church, FBC Gaston, was founded during this boom time. Mount Ebal, down in Batesburg, was founded during this boom time. I think they're 1836, Terry, I think. So why was this 20-year period in our history such a boom time? Number one, it was on the back end of the Second Great Awakening. So there were revivals going around that stemmed from the Second Great Awakening. Now, you might remember the impact that the First Great Awakening 80 years prior to this with George Whitefield had when he came to Charleston, and we talked about that in some of our early lessons. Now, I do want to go ahead and tell you, it's called the Second Great Awakening, but for the southern states, this is the First Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening, I'm really going to confuse myself. The First Great Awakening in the north didn't come south other than on the coast of South Carolina, where George Whitefield preached in Charleston. So what Northerners call as the Second Great Awakening was really the First Great Awakening for us. And so that's kind of a big deal. Now, the Great Awakening revivals have always affected SC Baptist in big ways. Now, I am biased, but I think that you can make a strong argument that South Carolina Baptists have historically been sensitive to the moving of the Holy Spirit more than other southern states, comparatively speaking. Now, I know that's a bold thing to say, but I think there's evidence there that you can make the argument that South Carolina Baptists have been sensitive to the Holy Spirit historically, which I think is really special. Now, we need to remember historical, I already told you that. So for many South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia Baptists, this is the First Great Awakening. Secondly, South Carolina Baptists were supporters of revival, and historically it's called pro-revival. So most SC Baptists are all about that. Now, what's really interesting, and when I say these churches, when I mention these churches at this time, we don't have big churches, okay, at this time in South Carolina. Big churches are not a thing. The biggest church in this time period in South Carolina was First Baptist Columbia. And I've got their history book. It's really well done. I bought it when we went to the shop a few months ago. Oh, man. If you ever get a chance to go to the coffee shop at First Baptist Columbia and buy that book, please buy that book. Dr. Wills was my professor at Southwest. He was my Baptist history professor, and he wrote that book. And I saw him at the convention. He was at Southwestern for 2 years, and then he decided to go back to Southern. Wonk, wonk, wonk. So anyway, I ran into him at a convention. I said, man, you did a great job on that. So at that time, and if you read the book, at this time, First Baptist Columbia had around 120, 130 people, and they were the big church. Most of your churches at this time, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, pushing it. I know our church was a pretty good size. It was in the 60s, 70s, up and down, but I know in 1865 it went all the way down to 15. So there's a lot of ebbs and flows, just like there is today. But what's really interesting about the revivals that come to South Carolina at this time, so the families, because most of these churches are just families, the families in our South Carolina Baptist churches had different opinions on the methods used in revivals. So this is a really interesting argument to have. So with the revivals, everybody, not just Baptists, everybody has an opinion about how revivals were done. And I'm not going to get into all this, but I had to write a 20-page paper about this when I took Dr. Will's class, and it was fascinating. So I got a little joke here for you. You know, when you have three Baptists together in one room, you got 17 opinions, at least, right? So Baptists have always been opinionated. We've always been that way. The opinions that were raised by these families in local churches, Dr. Nathan Finn wrote that they would ask the question, should we participate in those meetings if the Methodists and Presbyterians are going to be there? Baptists did not like to cooperate with Baptists, so they sure didn't like to cooperate with other denominations. And most people shunned Baptists, so they didn't like that. So why would we go to a revival if there's a Presbyterian there, right? The other is, are the camp meetings too unruly for us to be a part of? At this time, and I'm making a lot of arguments today, I think you can make a strong argument that Baptists in the 1820 to 1840 time period are the most rigid. We reach the peak of our rigidness. And what I mean by rigid, I mean church discipline like you wouldn't believe. I mean, an incredible amount of church discipline. You can read about it in our records. We have that. All Baptist churches at this time do. And so, speaking of Dr. Wills, he wrote a great book about Georgia Baptist and how they did it. So, church discipline actually starts simmering down in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. And so, to give you a few ideas of what it was like, if, let's say, Marion and I go on the back porch. I can't play a banjo, but let's pretend I can. And I play a banjo and Marion starts dancing. If somebody finds out that Marion was dancing, two deacons would come to your house, and there's a strong chance you're going to be voted out of church. Dancing was not permitted by Baptists. You couldn't dance. And I think I might be wrong, Hayward, but is it still on the books that you can't dance in the fellowship hall?
Yes.
Wow. All right. There you go.
Standard Baptist Church was like that when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Boy, you do anything down in that basement to do with dance and to playing music, and you'd have somebody down there on your throat.
Yeah. Well, I guess the Baptists would have voted King David out then, because King David danced when the Ark of the Covenant came. So, and I've touched on this last week, especially in South Carolina, moonshine is the main thing. Everybody drank. And so if you got wind that you were drinking, they'd vote you out of church. And what's really interesting is there's not, at least what I've read, and I might be wrong, there's not a whole lot of, we want to restore you. You're gone. You're bad. You're not Baptist anymore. And so that was really detrimental, but that was how they did it. Terry, I know you know a lot in that area. Anything you want to share about church discipline?
Well, I know when we went to school, as soon as we went to high school, we thought all the Methodists were going to go to hell. Because they always held dances in their church. Well, all of us from Gaston, dancing was taboo.
Mm-hmm.
So there was that little friction, even in high school, when I went. So
yeah,
you're right.
wow.
You're right. Discipline. I say a lot of churches would run the pastor off if the doctrine wasn't exactly right.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
If they didn't agree, it may be right, but it wasn't what they agreed with.
Yeah. If it wasn't with their tradition. Yeah. Do you remember when you were young, were y'all still voting people out at that time, or no, that had gone away? Yeah. So it kind of fizzled out, but at this time, man, that church discipline, and the pastors never got involved. It was the deacons would come to your house and you'd be gone. It was really interesting. One of my, so his name was, it's weird how it's written. So my third great grandfather, his name, the way it's written is Canada, but the way it was pronounced was Kennedy. So his name was Brady Henderson, and at that time he was down in Lawrence, and this is in the 1830s and 40s at this time. And so he was doing some work at Chestnut Ridge Baptist Church, which I have a lot of relatives buried in their old cemetery. And I don't know what happened, but there was a dispute between him and the church. I think the church said they were going to pay him $20 to do construction, and they gave him $19, something like that. But there was some contention there, and they voted him out. And so he goes to Transylvania County, North Carolina, because he was so embarrassed about being voted out of the church. So I think that's interesting. So another thing they had questions about with revivals were what about altar calls. For Baptists at this time, altar calls were not the norm. That did not happen. And you say, why did that not happen? A lot of Baptist churches at that time have Calvinist roots, and so that's one reason why they didn't have invitations. And so Baptists were not big on that. And then the others would say, should we even plan a revival? A lot of South Carolina Baptists felt that revival should come naturally, organically, not planned. And so at this time, they want to see God move. They just have a lot of questions about methodology, believe it or not. Third thing as to why this was a boom period, the general population in South Carolina was moving westward. There was a population migration. People are moving from the low country, they're moving from Charleston, and they're going to the up country. And so they're moving from the coast to the low country for more land and prosperity and less populated areas. At that time, the Midlands and up country were densely populated, but not for long. So the Baptists that are moving into the Midlands and up country during this time started a trend that is going to stick until the 1950s. When Baptists moved to a new area, they start a new church. So you wonder why there's a Baptist church on every corner. That's why. They go to a new area, okay, we got to have a church. And so that's really interesting. My dad's dad, not my dad's dad, my dad's grandfather, he was a deacon, and believe it or not, he was actually preaching as a deacon in the 70s. He was preaching one Sunday morning because the pastor didn't show up that day, and it was in the 1970s, and he was preaching, and while he was preaching, he got a heart attack and died in the pulpit. Just fell over, dead. So that was crazy. And so he was a deacon. I can't remember his name. That's awful of me. I can't remember his name. But it was my great-grandfather. And so he and his wife were a part of planting 3 churches in Pickens County. Now, their reason for planting those churches wasn't great. If they got offended, they'd leave and go plant a new church. So I'm not saying that was good. But that still stayed on about planting new churches. So that's a great reputation for us to have, and explains why we are still the largest Protestant denomination in America with 47,000 Southern Baptist churches, 16.2 million members, but only 4 of those quote-unquote members attend at least one Sunday a month. That's bad. The Baptists then, and I would even argue the Baptists of today, have a as you're going, take it with you mentality. As you go to a new place, take the gospel with you, plant a new church. So far we've discussed and learned today South Carolina has good news. We have talked all the way in this class about good news. Now we need to talk about some bad news. We need to talk about some bad things because that is a part of our history. Fourth question, were SC Baptists complicit in the white supremacy of the 1800s? Yes. The majority of South Carolina Baptists went along with and even supported the white supremacist movement of the 1800s. Now, let me go ahead and state from the get-go, I am the descendant of several Civil War veterans. I love our state. I love our country. I love the South. But I'll tell you first and foremost that for me and for our church, and I believe everybody in this room agrees with me, that racism is wrong. Scripturally, racism of any kind is wrong. So I'm not advocating for any of these acts that occurred by our ancestors, but you need to know that it happened. You need to know that. So obviously here we believe Christ died for all people. Based on that, I believe that we're all sinners, and it's not based upon the color of our skin. And so because of that, we as a church believe in serving and loving all people. And I think you see that here, and I know you guys agree with me in that. But for the sake of this class, we need to take a dive into the tragedy of racism. And I want to remind you, we cannot erase history or change it, but we've got to tell the truth. We've got to tell what happened. So 4 years before his death, Richard Furman in 1822, as an older man, gave his exposition of the views of Baptists on African Americans in America at that time. So he gives what he calls an expositional sermon, which you and I would not call it that, but he calls it that. And so his belief, and by the way, Richard Furman did own slaves. And so his belief and exposition on African Americans, he became a leading voice in the country that slavery was not something that people should tolerate, but they should accept it and use it as a means of missions. Okay, that's not how to do missions, obviously, but that was their belief on how to do it. Now, I personally find that very manipulative. It is sinful, but it is very manipulative. He argued that it was a positive good, that God himself had ordained it for the goal of Christianizing and civilizing African Americans. Okay, that's not true either. And I do want you to know the kind of slavery that you see in the movies is the most extreme kind. They were not all like that. Not all of them were that way. I've been talking a lot about family history, but you guys remember Kennedy? His dad owned 8 slaves, but they lived together. They didn't live in the outhouse. They all lived in the same home. So you got to think about that too. Now, don't go telling everybody that I have relatives that own slaves, because the way our media does things, they'll take it and run with it. But he argued that it was positive good. And due to Richard Furman's exposition and belief, many SC Baptists are going to take this approach. So among South Carolina Baptists, slavery is encouraged and it continues very strongly. Now, I believe it's 100% wrong, but it doesn't take away the fact that Furman and other SC Baptists felt that it was okay. That's our history. 5th question, what other SC Baptist voices supported slavery in the mid-1800s? 1845, the First Baptist Church of Beaufort, their pastor, Richard Fuller, and so that's a big Baptist name, would co-author a book with a man named Francis Wayland, and the book was entitled Domestic Slavery Considered as a Scriptural Institution. And so in that work, Fuller takes the pro-slavery side of the argument and states that the Bible teaches slavery. He says that it is there and the Bible doesn't condemn it. He says that God uses slavery to advance the gospel and that Christian masters shouldn't feel like they have to coerce to free their slaves, or shouldn't be coerced to free their slaves, but they should treat their slaves humanely. So there's that. And so this is shocking to you and I, but Richard Fuller does represent the main belief of most SC Baptists at this time. And not just SC Baptists, but Baptists in the South held this view, which is why we split from the Triennial Convention in 1845. So this is a dark time in our history. We leave the first Baptist convention in America because of a race issue. That's why we left. 6th question, why did the Southern Baptist Convention form in 1845? That is the reason we have the name Southern Baptist Convention. It was Baptist churches in the South coming together. And so the Southern Baptist Convention formed in 1845 because of the disagreement between Baptists in the North and Baptists in the South. Now, I think this teaches you and I a really valuable lesson. And I know I'm supposed to be teaching, but I'm going to preach to you for a second. You and I must be careful that we don't become captive to the idols of the culture, whatever they may be, and end up celebrating or embracing practices and priorities that are contrary to God's Word. And so that's what they got into. And man, it was bad. You and I cannot pretend that the position of our ancestors, it was a bad thing. But we can't make excuses for them. But what's important is that we don't let the same thing happen to us. I'm not saying that we're going to have slavery again. I do want you to know slavery is very, very much still happening in America because of sex slavery. It is a real thing still going on. So I don't believe, I'm not saying that kind of slavery will come, but you and I can worship idols in our culture that are just as bad. We know all sin is equal according to Scripture. So when it comes to history, never forget our children and grandchildren will be affected by the decisions you and I make. You and I are no longer getting race-based slavery wrong, I don't think. But we must ask ourselves, what are we doing today as SC Baptists that we shouldn't be doing? Where have we compromised with the culture? Where are we trying to justify things that we should not be justifying? And so the slavery generation of SC Baptists were bad, and they had bad tendencies that they needed to allow Christ to cleanse. So last little thing I'll say a little bit about slavery. South Carolina, very, very racist history we have. You could put us up there with any other southern state. I would say South Carolina and Alabama, Mississippi are all neck and neck for the most racist history. You could make arguments for different states. What's really bad in South Carolina, what's really bad about South Carolina is our racism. And I think you could argue this, and if you disagree, that's cool. I think racism got a whole lot worse after the war than prior to the war. I think it escalated like crazy, especially the 1890s. Tillman, Wade Hampton, all those guys, man, you talk about some racist guys. So yeah. Any questions or comments?
Got one.
Uh-huh.
When was there a split from the Southern Baptist? You got Independent Baptist,
Mm-hmm.
you got Free Will Baptist.
Mm-hmm.
When was we were all kind of one, and then just as
Yeah.
years go by?
Yeah. So, I kind of mentioned it earlier. So, whenever there were doctrinal beliefs and the association had to get involved, that's kind of when that started. As far as the independents, I don't know because doctrinally we're pretty similar to independents, if not the same. We're just different in our method. The main difference between Southern Baptist and Independent is Independent, they're not into the whole cooperative program thing. They do missions differently than we do, and the cooperative program doesn't become a thing until 1925. So I'd have to study it more, but I would assume that's when Independents started doing their own thing. But with free will, it happened early on because that's a huge doctrinal. That came about early on with the doctrinal belief of Free Will Baptists believe you can lose your salvation. So that's where they differ from us. A lot of denominations believe that. That's good, Chuck. But as far as the independent, I don't know if you could track it. It'd be a really hard thing to track.
Well, like I remember, like y'all know Gene Rowell, obviously.
Yeah.
Camp Street. He grew up in this church, right?
Yeah.
So and I know they're Independent Baptists, so that's why I was wondering just when, because we've been Independent Baptist church, we've been Independent Baptist.
Yeah.
Just kind of curious when the.
Yeah. You want to comment on that?
Not really, because I don't know.
Yeah.
Why, Gene, he came to church here as a kid, and he probably accepted Christ.
Yeah.
I heard him at a funeral one time say he left a church. He said he left a church. I only know the one that he left, and that was us.
Right. Yeah.
He said I wasn't getting fed, and I left that church. Wasn't getting fed what?
Yeah. Yeah.
I came here and I was fed, so I can't help but believe we had the same teachers, preachers, and everything. So only he could answer that question. And I love Gene Rowell. I think the world of him.
Yeah. Yeah, I know his main thing today because he and I have talked about it. I know his main thing is translation. So he's big on King James only, that kind of thing. So I don't know, but at that time we were King James only as well, I would assume. So anyway, any other comments, questions on that?
There was a lot of, like you talked about that, when I went in the army in the 50s, military was just beginning to immigrate. And we immigrated in there, but when you went on leave in the town, the blacks went to their section of town, the whites went to, we still segregated when they went on leave in the town.
Yep.
And they were just beginning to immigrate in the military in the 50s when I went in.
Well,
it was.
Yeah. I think what's really interesting, I was telling Mike and Tony Kelly this, we went to revival this week. I grew up in a really odd community. Greer, really odd community. So if you go to Greer, there's the white section and there's the black section. The blacks live in an area called Sunnyside. They don't want to live near us, and I guess the whites don't want to live there. I don't know what it is. There's not one white person that lives in Sunnyside. And there's probably 2,000 people that live in that little community. And it's part of Greer, but white people do not go there. I remember when I was playing basketball, my uncle was my basketball coach, and we had a kid that we had to drop off, and I will never forget this. He said, Brady, I don't have tinted windows. You're going to need to lay in the floor. White people were not supposed to go in Sunnyside. and we were dropping them off after practice.
I had a guy do that to me in Gaston in '78.
Really? Yeah.
I worked with '79. I worked with him, and he said, I asked him to come to my house and eat dinner with me. He said, where you live? I said, Gaston.
Yeah, yeah.
He said, we don't go to Gaston.
Yeah, there's a reason for that. But when I grew up in Greer, if you go into the lunchroom at Greer High, and I don't know if it's this way or not. And by the way, I graduated in 2018. This is not very long ago, and Hannah can back this up and verify this. In our lunchroom, big old lunchroom, you've got 4 sections. Well, not really 4. It's more like 3. But the whites have one side, the blacks have a corner, and Hispanics have a corner. And that's just what we did. I mean, and I'm not a racist by any means, but you didn't cross the other side of the lunchroom. And so, you know, racism is still existing. I know for us in high school it was, you know, and you see it a lot now. And by the way, you know, I personally, you know, you can have your own belief. I don't believe it's not a sin according to the Bible to marry a different race, but you are making it harder on yourself because there's different cultural preferences. Because when the Bible says don't be unequally yoked, it's talking unbeliever, non-believer. And I know when I was in high school, if a person dated somebody of a different race, the race they left, they couldn't date anybody of that race again. That's just how it was. And still is with the people I grew up with in the community that I'm from. So it's interesting. Every community's got its own little thing. You know, they all have their own little thing, but that's how it was. Now, when we were on the football field or the basketball court, that's cool, no problem. But other than that, nope. And that's like I said, I graduated in 2018, so I don't know why Greer's that way, but it is. Yeah.
I graduated in 1967, and we were in the first group of immigrants. The school was immigrated in Columbia. My daddy, boy, he had to talk with all of us kids about those children are having to go, and they're not wanting to be there.
Yeah.
And you better not do anything to hurt their feelings or in any way other than trying to help them through it.
Yeah, they didn't want to go.
My daddy, oh gosh, you would be alive if, you know, he found out something like that was going on.
Yeah.
So we respected those people. There wasn't but 2 of them.
Yeah.
And they ended up graduating from Carolina. But and the school, Drew High School, no problem whatsoever. Everybody treated those kids the same. I was in classes with them.
Yeah,
and
that's good.
You know, that whole school did. I don't know. It was like everybody's daddy done told them.
Yep.
You mess with them kids, and you're gonna be in trouble.
Yep. Yep.
You know, just for clarification, Greer is not an anomaly.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the same thing here.
Mm-hmm.
I get in the neighborhoods in Columbia right now.
Yeah.
The blacks do not want you there.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want you to live in it. And it's not as much racism as it's just culture.
Yeah.
They just don't want you
there. Yep.
And you know, I think we beat the racism thing to death and not concentrated on we're all God's people, but we're different.
Yeah.
We're a different culture.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean that you can't, you know, you need to respect one another.
Absolutely.
But we're just not the same.
Yeah.
And I think we miss that when we don't teach our children that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a lot like Marion, you know, but let me tell you, with my family, you better respect, especially the older, you know, black adults.
Yes.
You better not disrespect them.
Yeah.
At the end of the world,
Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate you clearing that up. Yeah. Greer's not an anomaly. Yeah. Buddy?
I'm working in got hired in with these fellows, and they could tell they were raised there at home. They didn't think that you was white or any other color. You were dumb and uneducated. there was a guy, granddaddy, and my granddaddy were best friends together. And his grandson happened to get a job there. We hadn't seen him on another years, probably 20, 30 years. Of course, we recognized one another. They were, Bill, Frederick over this young man, and I said, he's right there, won't you go tell him, see how he reacts, what you see. You know him? I said, I tell you how good I know that man right there. I said, his granddaddy whipped my ass more than one time.
Oh, me.
And their relationship was fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one thing I've never seen.
Yeah. Good.
I think this is a good time for me to say something that, people have come to me and probably to Hayward too, say, I hear the First Baptist Church of Gaston the deacons voted one time not to allow blacks to come to this church. And I said, that's not the case. Here's what happened. In the deacons meeting, we got word that a black person who was an activist had called the pastor saying, we don't know, it never happened, but he said, we're gonna come and disrupt your service.
Black Panthers?
Could have been,
We don't know.
It was a local group.
Gotcha.
And what we did, we never voted to not let blacks come to church. We did vote that if they did come to start trouble, we would just dismiss. Somebody would pronounce the benediction, and everybody would go home. We'd open the doors and go home, not to have a confrontation with them. That was the only vote that was ever taken in this church that I'm aware of, right? To ban blacks from coming. We've never done that.
And I can tell you for a fact, the same thing happened at Springdale Baptist Church.
Yeah. It was, there was a
I know
group
that
going
for a fact.
around trying to cause trouble, yeah.
It was all about, if you come to worship, then you're welcome.
Exactly.
If you come to
Yeah.
cause problems, then we're just,
Yeah.
when I was in that business meeting, I remember that as a kid.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we would still do the same thing today if a group came in.
With anybody.
Yeah,
They come
yeah.
in here and start causing problems,
Yeah.
best thing to do is just dismiss.
Yeah. Thank you, Terry. That's good. All right, we'll have discussion in a second. Let's get through this. Question 7. What was the Southern Baptist Convention like in the early days? To start out with, 3 of the first 5 Southern Baptist Convention presidents, 3 of the first 5 had close ties to South Carolina. So the first president of the Southern Baptist Convention was William Boulain Johnson, who served as president from 1845 to 1851. He was pastor at Edgefield First Baptist. That is one of our most historic churches, is Edgefield First Baptist. They have been awesome for many years. That's where R.G. Lee was. He was also president of the Edgefield Female Academy. He pastored in Greenville, Utah, Columbia, and was the chairman of the board of Southern Seminary that was at Greenville at the time. And then he moved it to Louisville. But he was president of the Johnson Female Seminary in Anderson that would eventually come to be known as Anderson University. And so female seminary, what does that mean? That means they were training women to go on the mission field. So, and I don't know if you've picked up on this, but as South Carolina Baptists, we've got 3 missions offerings. They are all named after 3 female missionaries. And I think that's really cool. Annie, Lottie, and Jannie. So, anyway, the 3rd president of the Southern Baptist Convention was Richard Fuller. He left First Baptist Beaufort in South Carolina in the year 1846 for Baltimore, Maryland, where one of his church members was a young lady at the time, Annie Armstrong. So that's where that comes from. At this time, Richard Fuller was considered by most Southern Baptists as the most eloquent preacher in America. Baptist preacher, at this time, he was the guy. He was always preaching at the denominational meetings, and when you need a guy to give a sermon, he was the guy that would give the sermon. He was very well known for his preaching. The 5th president of the Southern Baptist Convention was James Pettigrew Boyce. And so he was the founder of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Talked about that. He had previously been the pastor of First Baptist Columbia, also taught theology at Furman. I decided not to go in depth about how Furman started because we would spend all day. It started out Southern Baptist School, went liberal, they're no longer Southern Baptist. So that's that about Furman. James Boyce relocated the seminary in 1877, so it did start out in Greenville. So since our inception, SC Baptists have created some of the greatest leaders who have served our convention. And that still continues today. The president of the National Pastors Conference this year is from Spartanburg. He's a pastor at Anderson Church at the Mill. That's DJ Horton. So South Carolina has very consistently produced national leaders at the convention level, which is really cool because we're one of the smallest state conventions as far as compared to other states. On Sunday, October 13th, after our break next Sunday, we're going to dive back in and we'll get into the 1860s. We'll talk about the Civil War. We'll talk more about church discipline, give you a few more examples about church discipline, and kind of go from there. Any other questions or comments?
And we got the Southern Baptist Convention.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a Northern Baptist Convention?
Yeah, so that is the triennial.
Okay, so it's still around.
So the triennial is still around today. See, buddy. They are now the American Baptist Convention. So that's what they are now. Yep. And so I want to go back to the question you asked earlier about how do we have different kind of Baptists. I can't remember the name of the church. Y'all might know it. If you go to Anderson University, right down the road, there's that big church. I don't know if y'all remember the name of it. It starts with a B. Boulevard Baptist Church. Right down from Anderson, half mile from the campus. They started out as Southern Baptists like most, and liberalism gets into it. And once they start drifting, they start leaving. And they go to these other associations that are more liberal. First Baptist Greenville is that way. First Baptist Anderson is that way. They're extremely liberal. There was a big church in Greenville that just closed. I can't remember what the name of it, but they were a Baptist church. They were not Southern Baptist. We kicked them out years ago. But they closed because they started supporting same-sex marriage in Greenville, and the church got down. I mean, it was a 1,000-person auditorium, and they got down to 10 people.
Yeah,
and
the
they
churches
closed.
that are okay with female pastors, and then the Southern Baptist Convention says,
Yes.
disassociate with you. Why would they advocate to still be part of the convention if they know they're not wanted?
The main argument that Rick Warren made, Saddleback Church, and he's commissioned off most of his church plants. They are women pastors. Rick Warren advocates that they want to stay in the convention for cooperative giving. They still want to be a part of the missions aspect. But that's what we argue about every year. Last few years I've gone to the convention. But there's two sides of the argument, but at the end of the day, we've got a really good system right now of if somebody is not in friendly cooperation, it goes to the association sends it to the state, and then the state to the national, and that's what we do at the convention. We have a list of churches that are not in friendly cooperation. The other thing about that is it's not just that, the women pastor thing, the whole sex abuse thing. So there was a church, I don't know if anybody knows Jerry Mullinax in here. This is public knowledge. But Jerry Mullinax is from Greer. He taught at Burns High School. And he pastors West Hendersonville Baptist Church. And somebody did some digging and found out in 2004 that he had an inappropriate relationship with a student. And that West Hendersonville Baptist Church knew that and still decided to call him his pastor. So they said, we're going to vote you out this year, or you can go ahead and leave. And his church left and became independent. So that's kind of how the whole sex abuse thing that has gone through the convention in the last 10 years has really, there are people trying to find dirt on anybody, trying to get people out of the convention. And it's evil.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. Had he repented of that openly to his church, that would have been a different story, wouldn't it?
I talked to him, and he said that he did not come out and tell the church. But if they would have asked him, he would have told them.
Was he married?
He is still married.
At the time.
Yes. Yeah, it gets hairy. It gets hairy. Jerry, that individual, and I love Jerry. I love Jerry to death, but you know, and that's the other thing. They use that phrase inappropriate relationship now. You really don't know what happened, which is probably a good thing. But, I know Hannah, she has struggled for years with Frank Page, who baptized her, was her childhood pastor. And, she asked me a few months ago, she said, do you think that I should be, since he's no longer in ministry, do you think I should be rebaptized? I said, no. and all that, had that conversation with her, but it does sting to her to know that, and the bad thing about Frank that say, he was at Pebble Creek in Travelers Rest, so he left the convention, he was working for the national convention, all that came out, he had to quit. Pebble Creek, he repented of it. Pebble Creek said, we want you to come be our pastor. He came and was the pastor there. And then he made the same mistake again, and they just removed him. So they're staying in the convention because they removed him, and there was open repentance. Now, the church is autonomous, so the church gets to decide whether or not that man is still qualified. That's the local church's decision.
Now, would that be like the same thing as like Dr. Lawson out in California, Texas?
Yeah, what about him?
Just like being no longer the pastor of that church. Well, I guess another church could call him. If they
decided to, they're autonomous. If the church votes on it, they can do that. Now he is very reformed in his theology, so the thing that makes that interesting is most Reformed churches aren't going to touch him. Calvinist churches aren't going to have anything to do with him anymore.
But if a church were to call someone like that, could the Southern Baptist Convention kick them out of the convention?
No.
Okay.
No, not if they make that decision. Now, if there are allegations that are not in the open, like was the situation with Jerry Mullinax, that's different. But if the church makes that decision, and there's, that's fine. The convention gets involved when there's cover-up.
Okay.
That's when they get involved. And, it is said the congregation didn't know, 2 deacons knew and didn't do anything about it. There's a whole, it's a mess. But yes, if a church wanted to call Dr. Lawson, they could. But, that's the thing with that too. We don't know the severity of that either. Johnny Hunt still preaches. And that's up to the pastor's discretion. Now, the thing about Johnny Hunt that makes that interesting, and I know we're taking a turn, and if y'all need to leave, feel free to. The thing that makes the Johnny Hunt thing is he had repented of that. He had been in counseling. He had gone through all that. And somebody dug that up and threw it on him.
Well, then how many times do you tell your church? Every time you get a new deacon, do you say, let's sit down, I've got some things to share with you? Or a new
I don't know.
It's crazy.
I don't know. I hope I'm never in that situation. Yeah. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I really don't know how that works. And that's a whole mess. Any other comments, questions?
Talking about Johnny Hunt, he repented that, the people still bringing it up. I come to the point that God forgive him, we got to forgive him.
That's right. Yep. And I agree 100%.
We go back to David.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. No, I totally agree with you, Hayward. And
You put the Apostle Paul as a preacher knowing his history?
Yeah.
Apostle Paul, would you make him a preacher knowing his history?
We wouldn't hire that.
Yeah. So, and the thing with Dr. Lawson, has he openly repented? Do we know?
I don't know. From what I heard, the father of the young lady that he was in a relationship with said, either you tell your deacon body or I.
Gotcha.
And he said, if anyone's going to say it, I. So it wasn't like, okay, I did this and I'm sorry. It was kind of like,
Yep.
So.
Yeah. And that's the main thing.
But she was in her 20s. Not that it's better, but it wasn't like that.
And he was 73. And don't forget, and I'll close with this. what we think in our minds is just as bad. That's interesting, isn't it? All right, everybody good? Any questions? Kevin, you close us in prayer?
Sure. Lord, thank you for gathering us here today, God, for this course in our history, Lord. I thank you, God, for the mercy you gave us through this hurricane, and I pray that you would please be with those still without power. Lord God, protect us as we go about getting everything straightened back out, Lord. We thank you for your goodness and your grace, and of course the mercy of your Son, Jesus Christ. Lord, be with us as we go about our week. In the name of Christ. Amen.
Oh,